and I'm here to present on Hawaii and sovereignty, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. Um, yep. So, just want to give you a quick intro. Um, in the present day and in the past, like 50 years plus, Hawaii has been like a prime destination for like summer break, the tropical beaches, resorts, surfing, um, and uh, a lot of people have also moved there. It's one of the faster growing states in the United States. Um, but it's often overlooked that many indigenous Hawaiians have been living there before U.S. had annexed the islands. And when the arrival of colonial powers, after the arrival of colonial powers, their way of life and their culture have been threatened. Their um, political and sovereign power has been basically non-existent, and they've been placed in a social location where they hold very little socioeconomic status and power. And as a result, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement uh, was formed and is dedicated to restoring that sovereignty. So the thesis and my argument, my research question is, what is the goal of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, and why is it important? Why is it important that that they do restore sovereignty to indigenous Hawaiians? Like, how are indigenous Hawaiians affected by this colonization? And so my argument here is that uh, in the midst of being subjugated by colonial domination, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement is a necessary effort to restore sovereignty back to Native Hawaiians. So just to give you some history, some more context, um, before its annexation, before it became a state, um, Hawaii was an independent kingdom, um, and it had its own political and economic system. It had their own culture. And after the arrival of European and American settlers, the influence of Western powers destabilized the Hawaiian kingdom, and the queen uh, faced a coup, essentially planned by businessmen in the United States, because there was a very lucrative economic interest in Hawaii. Like some of the prominent figures in this coup was Sanford Beadle, and you might know him from like the Dole Agricultural uh, Corporation. And so the U.S.'s economic interest in Hawaii basically led to them overthrowing the monarchy and annexing Hawaii. Um, so subsequently, after the annexation of Hawaii, um, it became a state, and many people started to uh, immigrate into Hawaii. In fact, indigenous Hawaiians only make up about 9.71% of Hawaii's population, the largest racial group being non-Hispanic Asians, who count for 36.5% of the population. And so a lot of these indigenous Hawaiians have been pushed out of their land. They've been placed in a social structure where they had no say in the governmental and political structure. They have very little socioeconomic status and power in the system. And um, for that reason, a lot of them have very limited social mobility. And there's been a lack of wealth distributed to their community. And so they are a subordinate minority group, be dominated by uh, a white majority, like a settler majority from outside Hawaii who are not indigenous Hawaiians. And so a disproportionate number of Native Hawaiians live in relative poverty, where 11.3% of them live in relative poverty, which is higher than the overall average in Hawaii. And so stratification is much more difficult. It's a much more rigid system. And yeah, so obviously a big part of Hawaii currently is tourism, and tourism is a very big part of Hawaii's economy. But that has, in effect, harmed Native Hawaiians. Um, while it does great jobs and revenue, it has sort of displaced a lot of indigenous Hawaiians from their lands, and their traditions have basically eroded. Um, Essentially, the tourism industry prioritizes consumers and profits over any sort of ideological coherence, according to this source. Um, and the industry's growth has turned like sacred sites and turned like indigenous practices into tourist attractions, um, kind of eroding the indigenous culture. And additionally, living costs have skyrocketed in Hawaii, making it very hard for them to afford um, to live. And so for tourism, um, a a lot of their culture is misappropriated, and it's not treating it with any sort of respect, but instead use it for increasing profits, generating revenue, and it comes at the expense of their well-being and livelihood. So the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, this is one of their issues that they want to address, where they want to turn this business that profits off of their culture and land, they want it to be more fairly um, distributed. Because of the huge amount of settlers and immigrants coming into Hawaii, that has caused a lot of tensions between racial groups. Um, like I said, Asian immigrants are like a very huge part, very prominent part of Hawaii's current population. Something like 36.4% are non-Hispanic Asians. And so uh, another thing to consider is that a lot of the Asian immigrants were came here as laborers, and they were exploited by the white settlers to work in the plantations. So a lot of the uh, Asian immigrants or Asians who live in Hawaii um, front a claim that they are local, that they are not immigrants, and they sort of assert that they belong in uh, Hawaii just as much as uh, you're an indigenous person. Um, but uh, that also causes them to be sort of not be in solidarity with the sovereignty movement because they see it as a sort of threat against their so-called right to stay in Hawaii, to live in Hawaii. Um, Historically, Japanese Americans um, have gained a lot of political power in Hawaii. There's a big Japanese American population in Hawaii, and pervasive fear Japanese people feel is about the sovereignty movement is that their control of the Hawaiian lands and their control of the state is being challenged by this movement. And so this has caused racial tensions between Native Hawaiians and Asian Americans, Japanese Americans, which undermines the Hawaiian sovereignty movement. Because even though both are minority groups and both have been um, were exploited by Western settlers and both have been a victim of colonial domination. Um, it has also they've been pit against each other, where they've been forced to fight for limited opportunities, limited um, jobs and land, and so uh, this even though they have a shared experience of labor exploitation and racism, it's caused a divide between the two groups, and this has resulted in a lack of solidarity in the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, which diminishes the well-being of indigenous Hawaiians. So the Hawaiian sovereignty movement has been formed to sort of address all these issues, all these um, needs, all these things that indigenous Hawaiians are calling for. And so they began to take shape around the mid 20th century. They organized protests and legal challenges against the U.S. Occupation of Hawaii. Um, Obviously, the illegal annexation of Hawaii has sort of caused a lot of resentment, and a lot of indigenous Hawaiians did not recognize the this sort of U.S. control over the islands. Um, and so, one of the first momentum gaining moments is the Aloha Aina movement in the 1970s, which aimed to restore indigenous control over Hawaiian lands, which they have lost after the annexation. And they sort of also wish pushed to revive the cultural practices and language that was lost due to Western influence. And so these early efforts sort of kickstarted what would become a much a very important part of gaining sovereignty for Hawaii. So one of the priorities of the sovereignty movement and is the revitalization of Hawaiian language and culture. Um, After Hawaii's annexation, the Hawaiian language nearly became extinct because the provisional government banned Hawaiian medium education in 1896, and speaking it was discouraged. So in 1985, only 32 island children under the age of 18 spoke it, which is very, very little. Um, and so in 1987, the first organization of Hawaiian language educators, the Aha Punana Leo, worked with the Hawaii State Department of Education to develop curriculum for the first elementary indigenous language immersion classes in the U.S. So these Hawaiian language schools continue to this day, and they've been also integrated into the public education system. And Hawaiian culture has also been much more integrated into the public sphere. And so this has caused a resurgence, and essentially the movement aims to preserve and revitalize the the culture and language that was almost lost. Um, Another aspect of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement is the legal battles that they utilize, that they push in order to sort of create this political standing within the United States. They've lobbied for legislation and they've challenged U.S. authority. Um, for example, the Kalagui Hawaii, one of the largest organizations in the movement, is the only organization to actually implement an actual nation within the current state of Hawaii. So what that means is uh, there is so-called, or not so-called, there is a nation of Hawaii within Hawaii that is sort of independent from the state. And uh, they've obviously organized a lot of rallies and lectures to spread the word, and they push to restore the legal basis of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Um, a notable legal battle was the 1993 apology resolution, which Bill Clinton signed. Um, Basically, the U.S. acknowledged that the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the annexation of Hawaii was illegal, and as a symbolic um, apology, essentially. But it didn't offer reparations or full recognition of sovereignty, so it was seen as sort of insufficient by indigenous Hawaiians. In the present day, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement has grown a lot. Um, a lot more native Hawaiians are voicing their demands for self-determination, for economic freedom. Um, so that has created a lot of solidarity among the indigenous Hawaiians who are pushing for sovereignty. And also, social media, it has become a big tool that they have used to sort of create online spaces so that they can come together, and they can also educate those who are maybe not uh, directly in Hawaii, maybe they're in the mainland United States, but they can be educated and they can uh, sort of gather a lot of people who may not have known about this issue, and they can be educated, and so they can send support, they can contribute to the movement. And so social media has sort of allowed this activism to blow up and has been a big tool in the movement. So these are the references. Um, I'll give a little bit of a conclusion. Essentially, uh, the Hawaiian sovereignty movement has done a lot of work. They've done, uh, they've gone a couple decades building up their political standing, their power, and they've been gaining ground, but there's still much more to go. Hawaiian sovereignty is still not fully recognized, and Native Hawaiians are still being subjugated under this colonial power. And so the Hawaiian sovereignty movement is an incredibly legitimate and important movement in order to restore the culture, the way of life, the economic and political standing of indigenous Hawaiians. Um, and so it's is an incredibly necessary movement. And thank you.